all our subroutines had to be squeezed in 32 words. That took some squeezing. On top of that, and without having any clear sequencing discipline in your mind, on top of that, I don't think that I really knew what a variable was. Thanks to the fact that we were forced to change our instructions in store, it all just hadn't been sorted out. Okay. Other names that I have mentioned and rubbed out. Oh yes, I remember MC Debats because she was the author of the first production program of the ARRA. It had to do with the computation of transversational movements of railway carriages, and it was incredibly fast. We looked with awe to it. I, at least. She was bound to become Mrs. Dijkstra a year later. Okay, the only thing that I will mention of Gerrit Blaauw, who was very greatly appreciated, he came straight from Howard Aiken's laboratory and imported, apart from material, all sorts of decent techniques. Besides that, he was a very punctual man, and that was a good thing because for a couple of months, Gerrit Blaauw and I debugged the FERTA, which was installed at Schiphol aircraft. And that place was a little bit hard to reach, but Jerry had been in the United States, and thank goodness he had a car, at least some sort, an nth hand standard Vanguard. And he was living in The Hague at that time, and I was studying in Leiden. So early in the morning at 7 o'clock, I would jump on my bicycle and go through the highway, hide my bicycle, climb up, and wait at the side until Jerry came along and picked me up. It was a grim winter, and I know that it only could be done thanks to an old Canadian Army coat and the fact that Jerry, as said, was a very punctual man. Yeah. I remember one horrible occasion that we had been debugging the FERTA all day long, and it was somewhere 10 o'clock in the evening, and his nth hand standard Vanguard was the last car on Fokker's parking lot, and it was beginning to snow, and the thing wouldn't start. I don't remember quite how he came home. My guess is that Gerrit Blaauw fixed it himself, fixed another bug that day. Okay. Well, that's enough of history, I think. Now, I would like to combine what I knew, what I had understood, and what I have seen this last week. I beg your forgivingness, because part of it looks like and is perhaps a pointing out between the contrasts between what happened in Europe and what happened in the United States. Now, please realize that if I'm going to have to formulate that, I have to do that very, very carefully in order to avoid the impression that I'm just raking up the stale controversy between the old and the new world. Huh? You know that controversy, full of overcompensated inferiority complexes at both sides. That is not my intention. Huh? But this had to be written in a hurry, and if you think that you listen, that you hear in my words the raking up of that old controversy, please correct my words mentally. Well, as any scientist of my age, that was the first day of this conference, that Uncle Fritz explained that everyone under 50 had not to be taken seriously. Yeah. Okay, as any scientist of my age, I'm hoping for yet another few decades of fruitful research. And if the subject matter of my current activity showed signs of approaching a state of completion, I would therefore take that as a warning to shift my attention. But as we all know, such an intellectual migration can be a very difficult and painful process. And it's therefore reassuring to observe that still a lot remains to be done. It is for me, at my age, a personal pleasure to observe that computing science is still very immature. If I were 65, I would feel perhaps different about it. Okay. Now, one such sure symptom of professional immaturity is the heavy use of anthropomorphic terminology when referring to inanimate objects. And computing science is still loaded with it. Quite recently, I heard in a lecture, quote, "When this guy wants to talk to that guy," unquote. The speaker was referring to two components of a computer network. Yeah, giving them wishes and all that, terrible. Okay, now, a history of computing might, or probably even should, try to reveal the origin of that anthropomorphic tradition. In the meantime, we computing scientists shall try to get rid of it and try to clothe our thoughts in less misleading metaphors. Wait a minute. Yeah. The worst offense, of course, has been to call programming notation conventions languages. This has given rise to the most terrible confusions. From at least one respectable university, I have heard that a course in ALGOL 60 could contribute to your foreign language credits. Perhaps a more serious symptom was displayed in a letter from a general from the US Army that I saw last year. They were looking for new programming languages for the Department of Defense, but the general explained that obviously the DoD was not interested in, quote, artificially simplified languages such as Pascal, unquote. And what does the general want? Naturally complicated languages such as PL1? Artificially complicated languages such as ALGOL 68? Military logic is very queer. Okay. Now, I can give the historian one hint. By the end of the 50s, the heavy use of anthropomorphic terminology in computing science was a well-established tradition in the USA. It was not so in Europe. For many European computing scientists of my age, the more intensive exposure to American computing science dates from about that period. Say when the communications of the ACM started to appear. I think that was 59. And I remember quite vividly my surprise and amazement when I observed that heavy American use of anthropomorphic terminology. I was even somewhat shocked by it. I was certainly not the only one to feel that way. Further confirmation can be found in Fraser Duncan's after-dinner speech at the Baden Conference held in 1964. A speech which has been included in toto in the conference proceedings and can be recommended for many other reasons. Okay. At that time,
I didn't worry about the origin of that anthropomorphic tradition. How could I? I knew no American to speak of. And as far as I was concerned, it could just be a part of the American linguistic tradition. So I just accepted the fact and confined myself to trying not to copy the bad habit and occasionally correcting a countryman when he slipped into it. Now, 17 years later, the question of the origin of this anthropomorphic tradition intrigues me. Up to this conference, I had tacitly assumed that it could be traced to the American cultural climate and its linguistic habits. But I'm no longer so sure. During the past few days, I got more than once the distinct impression that possibly it could be traced rather directly to the talking habits of Dr. von Neumann. Historians might want to trace this. Rightly or wrongly, the idea that it's essential that a program modifies its instructions in store is generally contributed to Dr. von Neumann. And there seems to be less general agreement to the conclusion that that idea of Dr. von Neumann's should be classified as a major mistake. Now, exactly because Dr. von Neumann was such a great man, we must beware of the danger that our deserved admiration deteriorates into the undesirable worship that blurs our vision. I would bet that if we hadn't had such great admiration for von Neumann, the B register had been invented earlier. Okay, the above remarks have been triggered by the first few days of this research conference on the history of computing, by the remarks about the history of IDs, and by the consideration that the old tradition of the Roman Catholic Church requires that in the process of canonization, one of the cardinals performs the function of the devil's advocate. And up till now, no one seemed to have performed this function at this conference with respect to Dr. von Neumann. I therefore took that role, in spite of the warnings that St. Johnny is already a de facto standard, and that I would be stoned from the stage. I was particularly grateful for that last warning because it taught me a new expression. I sent something else, but I'm quite uncertain how to explain this to you. I've never spoken about it very much, and I'm not at all sure whether I shall be able to find the right words and expressions. I felt a strong analogy between an old issue among circuit designers and a modern issue among language designers. And whenever an issue becomes a controversy, causing a split between the experts in the field, the long-lasting existence of the controversy demonstrates the inadequacy of the means by which we try to settle the question. I got a glimpse of the way in which the old hardware question remained unsettled for many years, and suddenly realized that today's programming issue is in danger of remaining unsettled in exactly the same way for perhaps an equally long period of time. As that would be a profound disaster, we programmers could perhaps learn something of the causes that made it so long, so difficult for the hardware community to make up its mind. Let me sketch to you roughly the old hardware issue that circuit designers for clocked machines faced right from the beginning. In a clocked machine, there are basically two types of circuit possible. Let us call them A and B. Both types of circuit must assume that the components are not too slow. Well, this is obvious because an infinitely slow component is a component that doesn't work at all, and you can't be expected to make a working machine from non-working components. The difference is at the other end. While in a type A circuit, components are allowed to be infinitely fast, we have to assume for a type B circuit, in addition, that the components are not too fast. In type B circuitry, awful things would happen if components produced an instantaneous response. Proponents of type A circuitry felt that type A circuits were safer. If components turned out to be too slow, one could always change to a clock with a lower pulse rate, without running the risk that in the changed environment, other components would turn out to be too fast. Proponents of circuitry B pointed out that type B circuits needed fewer valves, and that by means of choice of sufficiently wide safety margins, the existence of a pulse rate suitable for all circuits could easily be guaranteed. The result was a complete deadlock that has lasted for about 20 years. But it so happens that there exists a completely different argument that nearly always should overrule all other considerations. In my innocence, I thought that it had settled the matter 10 years ago, but after a few discussions here in Los Alamos, I am less certain. The argument is that style A circuitry admits the separation of two important concerns that with type B circuitry remain inextricably intertwined. Because a type A circuit should also be correct for instantaneously working components, we can study it under that idealization. That is, under the elimination of timing considerations. We can check that the circuit will produce the correct result. A completely separate argument then has to show that the result, whatever it may be, so to speak, will be produced fast enough. Style B circuits do not admit this separation, and the total question has to be dealt with intertwined. Now, not separating concerns of which the separability has been discovered is always defended with the argument that you don't need the separation because you can cope still quite well with the complexity of the intertwined combination. Now, while this may be perfectly true for the specific case at hand, the refusal to separate consciously induces a style of designing and thinking that tends to block drastic progress. So for your own education, you should always choose type A circuitry for your design. It may take a few more valves, but that's easily gained back because your machine is much easier serviced. Now for the analogy. When you're programming, correctness of the result and cost of execution are among your major concerns. Both concerns are so important and each by themselves sufficiently demanding that we should try to separate them completely. But that means that while worrying about the correctness of a program, its execution should not need to enter your mental picture at all. Similarly, when worrying about the costs of program execution, we shouldn't need to worry about what result the program is supposed to produce. But this time, the possibility of separating the concerns depends on the programming language and in the way in which it has been defined. The controversy among language designers I was referring to is whether or not to define programming language semantics via an interpreter. Because the definition of the semantics via an interpreter intertwines meaning and interpretation as executable code right at the bottom. You can expect trouble when you try to disentangle them again. And on account of the above considerations, I'm absolutely certain that a necessary condition for progress is a definition of programming language semantics independent of any underlying computational model. But I leave it to future historians to figure out whether the fact that I have now pointed this out for this important audience has made any difference at all. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for very few questions, but let us accelerate.
Van Wijngaarden. There are 2 points in which I disagree with what the speaker has said.
Only two?
The first one is that the drums at the Mathematical Center run at 50 and 60 revolutions per minute respectively.
It was 50 and 75.
Per second they did. The second point in which I disagree I won't mention because I think the speaker is sufficiently excused by the age of Dijkstra.
I will, in fact, in that case, take the opportunity of cutting short these questions. We have very little time.
You think?
But I would like to take the opportunity of thanking Dijkstra for the lecture and suggest that we clap him in the normal fashion. I would also like to steal a minute or two to thank the organizers of this conference. It is a conference which I have enjoyed myself intensely, and I know that that has been shared by most other people. It is the only conference that I have ever been to where I have attended all the lectures and enjoyed them and found information of considerable use to me about things which I thought I knew and did not know. And I do not quite know how we can properly appreciate the efforts of the organizers, Nick Metropolis and Jack Walton. We haven't really time enough to thank him properly now, but nevertheless, I think the statement should be made. Nick Metropolis did ask for a few seconds to talk to you before we depart. We have, I think, about 6 minutes left to attain the bus, so this does give us time for a few seconds. But before that, I think we should applaud the efforts of the organizer, which are not only...
Thank you very much. What is meaningful about any conference is, of course, measured by the quality of the contributions by the participants. And I think on that basis, almost all of us would agree that it was moderately successful. On behalf of the full organizing committee, I would like to thank you all for the marvelous contributions that have been made and to wish you safe journey home. Thank you very much.